With all the events of the past week, I thought this format might be better for me trying to take an opportunity to reflect and try to provide some perspective that I've been thinking about a lot with watching everything that's been going down. A lot of the times when I taught history classes, it was always about providing context to things, and I think when I watch arguments nowadays, some of that kind of still comes back. Look, I think it's been a tough couple of days for a lot of people in this country and some around the world that are watching events in Charlottesville, looking at expanding and more powerful white supremacist movements than we've had in this country for quite some time. And I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on that topic of Confederate memorials and try to start a dialogue that can actually bring some people together on this topic. Too often in the debates that you're watching, there's people that always kind of have to make you pick a side. You're either liberal or conservative. You're either good, you're bad. And certainly there are circumstances where good and evil exist. But the problem is sometimes and most of the time there's nuance to it. So in a circumstance like Confederate memorials, it's impossible to be able to look at the situation in this country and say all Confederate memorials are bad, all Confederate memorials are good. It's about context and looking at the details of the situation. So a lot of people are asking, how could you have a good Confederate memorial, given that the Confederacy was an overt enemy of the United States? This is where the conversation has to get into the details, though, and often what you're seeing now is people don't want to focus on the details. They just want to lump it good or bad. We shouldn't do that. We really shouldn't at all. What we should do is ask the who, what, where, why, and how did the memorials and statues that are around this country that honor the Confederacy. Not to mention we should look at the memorials themselves, look at the symbology, look at what is in it, and ask ourselves, what's the purpose of it? Let's just start with numbers, high level, and start thinking of it from the very top all the way down. There are over 1,500 memorials and icons to the Confederacy throughout the United States. 1,500 plus. For a loss. Gut reaction, that's a bit overkill. I mean, I'm not going to say it feels like overkill to me, but it feels like kind of like if I were to do chemotherapy because I'm tired of shaving my head. It seems like going a little too far for what the circumstances call for. In this case, military loss. Now, let's think of another memorial, very famous one, that involves loss on the part of the United States. In Washington, D.C., you've got the Vietnam Memorial Wall that's there. Hands down, for me, one of the most moving memorials I've ever seen. The vast majority of the memorial are just the walls you're looking at here with the names etched into it of the casualties from the U.S. military during that war. As you get closer to the center of the memorial, the walls are by far over your head, and it's designed in a way to kind of make you think about the number of people that died in this war. Was the conflict worth it? And the walls are reflective, purposefully to reflect some of the other big monuments that are in D.C., like the Washington Monument, almost to ask people that are visiting it, was this conflict worthy of something like what George Washington would have taken on back in the day? Now, in addition to those aspects of the wall, the other that for me was one of the most moving was the statue off to the side of 3 Vietnam veterans. The emotion that is exuded from their face is clearly loss, despair, and sadness. It's not exactly a celebratory monument. It's looking at this very difficult time in American history and asking, would we do it again? Was it worth it? Think about the cost of war. It's not celebratory in nature. It is really trying to make the visitors think about the cost of war. So can we find Confederate memorials similar to that, trying to reflect upon loss? If you're a history guy like me, you love traveling to places that contain just rich experiences of history, and Gettysburg Battlefield is absolutely one of those places. Throughout that entire large area, you've got memorial after memorial after memorial, just so many different facets of the battle. It's to help you understand as you're walking around and going through the battlefield how things took place. Standing in the apple orchard in the back where the Confederate monument is, that lets you understand the distance from where the Union line was and knowing what Pickett's charge looked like. Again, it's helping to understand somebody like myself what that battle entailed and what it looked like. It's very easy to be able to look at this and say, this isn't necessarily something glorifying what the Confederacy stood for. That said, that certainly is not all of the monuments that are built and dedicated to the legacy of the Confederacy. Stone Mountain is a memorial in the state of Georgia. Stone Mountain is publicly owned, maintained, and is also the ceremonial and likely birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. Let's put that one on the bad list, also known as the institutional discrimination list. It should probably come as no surprise that the large majority of where these Confederate memorials can be found are in Virginia, Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, North Carolina. In other words, the former Confederacy. And we've kind of hit on the range here. There's one that is clearly bad and should not exist. It is an absolutely terrible thing to be able to memorialize. As a sidebar, an example, Germany's not going to have a large area to celebrate where the Nazi Party was created. Therefore, we shouldn't have one where our original terrorist group, aka the KKK, began their organization. By the way, that would be Berchtesgaden over in Austria. I've been there. They don't have large monuments to the Nazis over there for a reason. Now, on the other hand, we talked about Gettysburg. There are certainly ways that you can put up monuments to help understand what happened with the Confederacy, especially in particular battles. So how do we have the conversations? We got to look at the specificity of each of these memorials and what it lends to culture, whether it be positive or negative. Now, the other thing that should be pointed out here is going beyond what we might traditionally call a memorial. It's also things that are named after people in the Confederacy and kind of the question of, well, why was that the case? According to some research done, there's still many schools throughout this country, public areas, squares, named after members of the Confederacy, including Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the original members of the KKK. Further, when were these monuments built? When were these schools and public areas named after these people? That should also illustrate a lot of the reason behind why. The graphs you're looking at here show each dot when iconography became a part of America, when the memorials were built, when things were named. You can see the first real trend is right around the 1900s, turn of the century, and that was right during the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. That was part of the goal. The war was done, Reconstruction had already taken place, and as the South kind of got its act back together again, you had people trying to make the United States live the way they wanted to live under the Confederacy, and to make sure that these people, again, that they had their way, new people would understand exactly what they wanted to instill. You saw more and more statues being put up that aren't lamenting the war like what we saw with Vietnam. They're celebrating people that helped try to keep others in chains. Now, the second big push for when you started seeing memorials being added, and again, new things being named after people in the Confederacy, was during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. Again, we're not instilling these as a way to remember history. It was literally a way to try to tell people who are now trying to get the rights this country promised them, we're still trying to make it live like it was in the past. There has to be some understanding that these statues were put up for the purpose of oppression, to make people feel like foreigners and outsiders in their own country. And where we are in 2017 is that we still have over 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy in public spaces and over 109 public schools that are not only named after people that tried to enslave Americans, but have iconography of hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Looking at you, Jefferson Dragons. Asking young American students to go to schools that have symbols for the Klan, utilized to this day, is a humiliation of irreducible proportion. So what remains is a situation where there are thousands of specific details about thousands of specific icons that need to be talked about, need to be discussed about why are these things here in order to determine whether or not it is appropriate to leave it up or take it down. It's not as simple as all are bad, all are good. But of course, we need leadership to be able to help us with that. And at present, here's what it looks like.
I will tell you something. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have, you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now.
Okay, where to begin? So let's just start by saying it like this. The one side is a white supremacist group and the original terrorist group that attacked this country for years and continues to want to do so. And then, candidly, this is my favorite part of trying to equate the two sides.
You had a group on the other side that came charging in without a permit, and they were very, very violent.
You know, I studied history for a very long time. I taught it for most of my adult life. And you know what one aspect of all of the sit-ins and all of the protests about the 50s and the 60s that never occurred to me? Did they have a permit to do so? Because honestly, who cares? This was a group that came, in this case in 2017, to oppose white supremacist groups and a terrorist organization that is out there on the street. I don't think many people would have complained if it was an ISIS organized group that was out there also talking about their supremacy, but it just so happens that it was a different group and the dialogue is different around it right now. That's a whole nother conversation. But at this point, there's one other aspect of this I want to drill into. The example set by those that took part in sit-ins and protests that were nonviolent back in the 50s and 60s almost set an example that is too good. Because we kind of take it for granted, let's not forget that it took training. There were organizations that Dr. King and his movement organized. There was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There were people that had worked with others for years to train them how to deal with the type of oppression and the type of hate that was going to be geared at them, and they were trained for how to deal with it in nonviolent approaches. They weren't just people that were grabbed off the street, sat in a chair, and told, hey, be nonviolent. They were trained to be able to do this in many cases. We don't have that today. The worst thing that should be said about the people that came to oppose the white supremacists in Charlottesville is that they screwed up. They took it too far. They weren't ready. Their hearts were in the right places, but their minds weren't trained for how to deal with the type of hate that they were going to encounter when they were there, and they got violent as a result. But at the end of the day, this is one of those circumstances that is still good versus evil, and it should be recognized as such. The people on good just need to be trained for how to deal with the circumstances. So what about those memorials? And what about the conversation and dialogue around them?
This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
Since it's been brought up, it's actually a pretty easy line to be able to draw. Right down the middle between those that built this country and those that attacked this country. That shouldn't be a very difficult one to be able to look at. And look, I understand the argument is being made, hey, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they had slaves, so they weren't that great either.
George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now, are we going to take down his statue?
Look, the argument essentially boils down to this, that because they were born in a world and in their lifetime they didn't perfect the entire world, then somehow they're morally equivalent to all of the other horrible people that are out there. That is simply not the case. The fact is that, yes, they were born in an imperfect world, they died in an imperfect world, but they built a country on principles that allow for that world to advance and get better. Taking pride in what this country and our founding principles have done, not just for the rights of people here, but for the rights of people around the world, is normally one of those issues that should unite people. Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, most people do take pride in this country and what we have done for the good. And then after those last questions were raised by the president, things got more interesting about this topic of conversation.
And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. Take a look the night before. They were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee.
Roll video on that.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! Blood and soil!
Gonna go with no. Can we just agree to say that if you're marching with people that are chanting Nazi slogans and saying blood and soil and trying to assert their supremacy based on their skin color, you are not a fine person? I'm just gonna say that. And since we're on the topics of monuments, and apparently we need to talk about the issue of supremacy and what can happen if it's not called for what it is and left unchecked, let's look at another monument that might help us with this. 10 years ago, I was in Berlin, Germany. One of the most memorable sights from this historic city was the Holocaust Memorial. When you approach the monument, the stones that you see in the image are very small. As you walk into the maze, they get taller and taller to the point that you cannot see beyond the stones around you. Once in the middle of it, it can get very disorienting and it's easy to lose direction. That's kind of the point of the memorial. Things start small, and if left unchecked, you find yourself in a place you never quite thought you could be. That is how the people of Berlin remember the beginning of the worst chapter of their history. The Civil War here in the U.S. killed more Americans than any other war we've ever been in. The premise of the South was to fight for slavery. And yes, people will say it was economics, the economics of slavery. People will say it was states' rights. It was the states' rights to be able to install laws about slavery. It all went back to a common denominator. And we have over 1,500 icons in memorial of that, some of which are celebratory. Look, symbols of the Confederacy are simply one aspect to institutional discrimination that is still very much alive and vibrant in the United States of America. It's a long, deep conversation that needs to be had and is being had currently because of the conflict that's going on.
About race relations in America, and do you think things have gotten worse or better since you took office?
I think they've gotten better or the same. Look, they've been frayed for a long time.
Yes, I get to say I agree with Donald Trump. So then what do we do about racial discrimination that has been institutionalized in this country since its inception? The founders of this country were not perfect, but what they did is they gave us a set of principles to aspire to achieve a constitution that was good in its inception with the ability to amend it and make it better over time. In other words, let's drop the argument about what the founding fathers weren't. We know what they were. They were people that gave us the opportunity to be able to make things better. If we have the courage to be able to look at our fellow Americans and understand we all don't live the same experiences, and some of these icons out there are still incredibly painful and are being used by supremacist groups as a way to continue the oppression that this country has traditionally had. Of course, that's just my perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Footage shown in this video was taken from the Vice documentary shown on HBO. The link is below, along with a link to the full press conference from President Trump in Trump Tower this past week.